In today's video, I'm going to be teaching you step by step on how to build this super unique double planter bench. And the best part about this simple build, you'll only be needing basic construction material. So let's get started. So to start with for this bench, let's go ahead and build our planter boxes. For the outside of these boxes, I'll be using fence pickets, and for all of the framework, I'll be using 2x material. And if you missed the build video for this low profile lumber storage, make sure to check that out. And as always, I'll be teaching you step by step on how to build this bench, but if you're a plans in the hand type of person, head over to my website. I'll throw a link in the description. So let's start off by cutting our slats. I'm going to rip the very edge off of my picket just to make sure that I have a nice flat surface to work from. Then I'll set my table saw to 2 1/4 inch. And then rip my slat material down to size. You should get 2 boards out of each picket. Once I have that material ripped down to 2 1/4, let's go ahead and cut this to length. In order to make up the front and back of each one of these boxes, I'll need 20 boards that are 11 1/4 inch long. And then for our longer side boards, I'll need 20 of those that are 22 1/2 inches long. So now that we have 20 pieces cut of each one of our sideboard slats, let's go ahead and cut our inside corner boards. And for this, we're just going to be using standard 2x material. So the inside corner boards are what we'll be connecting our slats to. Like I mentioned, I'm just going to be using 2x material for this. I'll cut it at 1.5 inches wide, leaving me with 1.5 by 1.5 boards. And if you don't want to rip this material down, you can simply buy 2x2s at your local big box store. Regardless of whether you cut these or buy these, we're going to be needing 4 at 24 3/4 inch long for each box. Now I'm going to go ahead and lightly paint mine black. And the reason why I'm doing this is because we're going to have 1/4 inch spacing between each one of these slats. And I think by having these inside supports a contrasting color, it'll really set this off. So now that we have our 4 inside boards cut, painted, and ready to go, let's go ahead and put these side walls together. So for this, I just made a little jig. You do not have to make this, but if you're going to be making multiples of these, it's going to come in super handy. And that's all that I've done is taken some 2x4 scraps, lay these out at a 90-degree angle, took some scrap strips from my fence pickets that I just cut, and I put one going down the edge of the bottom just to raise this up, and then 1/2 inch in on the side. And the reason why I did this is because my inside boards, they're 1.5 inches wide, so I can put those flush against this left-hand side. And then whenever I install my slats, I'm going to be wanting 1/2 inch of overhang. So by making this little jig, it's just going to make things go a lot quicker. But again, if you'd like, you can just measure 1/2 inch on each side. Totally up to you. So now let's assemble our 2 end panels using our short slats. I'm going to start off by laying my 2 inner boards down and then space these out at 7 1/4 inch apart. This will leave us with 1/2 inch of overhang on each one of our slats. Now with my inner boards in place, I'm going to put some wood glue on my first slat and place it on top of my boards. And I'll be installing 1 screw in each one of these boards. And since these screws are going to be showing, I want them all to line up. So I'm going to measure 1 1/4 in from the end of my board and then 1 1/8 inch down. And I'll be doing this for both sides of the board. And if you want to make things go a little quicker, you can lay out your remaining 9 boards for this panel, find your screw placement on the last board, then just use a straight edge, connect your 2 marks, and draw a light line with a pencil. Now the only measurements that you'll have to make for these boards is the 1 1/8 spacing from the edge. And don't worry about the pencil mark, we can sand this off later. Now with my screw placement marked, I'm going to go ahead and install my bottom board. Now you can pretty much use any length exterior screw for this, just as long as it doesn't go through your bottom board. Then we'll pre-drill and slightly countersink. Since these screws are being placed near the end, this is going to prevent the material from splitting. So now that we have our first board installed, I'm just going to flip this around and install my last board. But first I'll make sure that I still have the correct spacing and overhang. And by doing it this way, you don't have to worry about measuring your overhang for every single slat. So really it doesn't matter which side is your top or your bottom. So you can just continue right where you're at, or you can flip it around. So now let's go ahead and install the rest of these slats. And I want 1/4 inch spacing between each one of these. So I just ripped down the edge of a 2x4 to make these little 1/4 inch spacers. These things will make things go a lot quicker, or you can simply just measure out 1/4 inch. So using my 1/4 inch spacers, I'll install glue and get these center slats into place. And if you enjoy projects like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and give it a thumbs up. So now with all my inner slats evenly spaced, I'm going to pre-drill and countersink each one. And the last step for this side panel is installing the screws. Now you could use brad nails or staples for this, but this is a pretty good sized box. So I think that adding these screws not only strengthens this up, but gives it a nice touch. Now we can remove our spacers and get ready to make our second panel. Now we'll only be needing to make 2 of these panels for each one of our boxes. The long slats will actually just attach right to the side of the board. So let's go ahead and assemble our second panel then we're ready for our long slats. And there's a couple of little tricks to speed things up that you'll figure out as you go, like lining all of your boards up and applying all the glue at once. Little things like that really come in handy whenever you're making several of the same type of item. So now with our two front and back panels made up, let's go ahead and install these side slats. So to help me to keep this front stable, I'm just going to slide one of these slats right underneath of the inner board. And voila. Then I'll just do the same thing for this opposite side. So to put this first side on, we'll be needing 10 of our long boards. And as far as the spacing goes, these will actually space themselves to the lengths of these boards. Because essentially all we're going to be doing is lining up the ends of this long board with the ends of our side panels. So since we're lining these up with our end panels, we can see exactly where our glue needs to go. So for each one of these slats, we'll just add some glue, match up our ends, measure out our screw placement, and then pre-drill and counterbore like we did for the ends. And we'll just install the remaining slats the exact same way, except for this time there's really no need for spacers since we're just matching the ends to our side panels. As you can see, I'm actually using my fingers kind of like spacers to help me line up the ends. Okay, so now that we have this side done, we'll just flip it over, do the exact same thing for the other side, and we're ready to put the trim on top. Alright, so now that we basically have our box made, only thing left to do on this is to add some trim. Now you can do this any way that you would like. You can use butt joints if you would like. I'm going to add a little bit of extra character and miter these corners. So for our top trim, we're going to be using the exact same material that we use for our sides. All of this will be 2 1/4 inch wide. The two long boards will be 24 inches long from tip to tip. And the two shorter boards will need to be 11 3/4 of an inch from tip to tip. So now with my trim cut, we can install. I'm going to start off by installing one of my long boards and lining it up so that the angle meets the tip of the inside board. Then I'm going to put down some wood glue and line my board back up. This should leave us with 1/4 inch overhang on the sides. Now to hold this board into place while I position the rest of my trim, I'm going to put one brad nail on each end. Once I get all my parts added, I'll go ahead and add some screws. Next we'll add an end piece and then keep working our way around. And for my screw placement, I definitely want a screw on each end to hit our 4 inner boards. So from each side of each corner, I'm going to measure 1 3/4 over and 1 inch in. Then we'll just pre-drill and counterbore like we did for the others. We'll do this for all 4 corners. And then for our 2 long sides, I'm going to measure 12 inches from the end, and then 1/2 inch in, and then place a screw in the center. Alright, so now we have one of our boxes done. And that's all you'll need to do from this point is maybe sand this up a little bit to get rid of some of these rough spots and pencil marks. Make your second one that is identical. Then we're ready to move on to our bench. Okay, so now that I have my second one made, I actually realized that I forgot something. So now I'm going to have to do it the hard way. And that is going to be what actually holds these plants in place. So since I noticed this whenever I was building my second one, I was able to go ahead and add those as I was building the sides. But for this one, since I didn't, I'm going to have to do it the hard way. So what you're going to need for this, regardless of whether you did it the right way or the hard way, is 2 of these 1.5 by 1.5 boards that are 19 inches long. And then I put pocket holes in the ends of each board. Now if you were installing these the right way, whenever you got to 12 inches from the top, you would have added one of these in between your 2 inner boards, then just covered it up with the side boards. Since I did not, I'll be installing these from the inside, again in the same place, just tighter quarters. Alright, so I'm going to set it in place at 12 inches from the top. Let's get this one in, and then we'll put one more on the opposite side. Okay, so now that we have these in, let's go ahead and put the floor in this. And then for the floorboards, we're just going to use the same 2 1/4 inch material. You'll need 4 boards that are 10 inches long. I'm going to install the first 2 right up against the side of my inside boards. And then the last 2, we'll use equal spacing in the center. Now to fasten these down, you can either use brad nails or screws. I'll leave that up to you. Okay, so now with those installed, now we're ready to move on to the bench. So now I'm going to go ahead and rip down the rest of the material that I'm going to need for this project. The bench itself will be made up of 1 inch by 1.5 inch slats. So I'll just be cutting these from 2x material. We're going to need 14 of these slats that are 46 inches long, and then one that is 45.5. And then we'll be needing to make some bench supports. And for this, we'll be using 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch material. Again, I can just get this from 2x stock. So once you have all of your slats cut to length, go ahead and just round over the top edges with a sander. And if you're planning on staining these, go ahead and do that now. That way later on you're not trying to get in between the little gaps and spaces and things like that. It would save you a lot of trouble. And as far as your 1.5 by 1.5 stock for the bench supports, I would go ahead and get that painted or stained as well. I chose to paint mine black for the same reasons that I did for the planter boxes. I kind of want this to show through and create a contrast. Now you can paint these before or after we assemble the seat supports. I would just make sure to get it done before we install. So speaking of these seat supports, this is what I'm talking about, and this is what it's going to end up looking like. Almost looks like club. So let's go ahead and get 3 of these made and get this thing finished up. Each one of these bench supports will be made of 2 parts. We're going to have a bottom board, and we'll have a connecting board that will act as our backrest. Since I want the back of the seat to sit at a bit of an angle, I'm going to make my first cut at 5 degrees to the right. And I'm just going to slide my board down, measure out the 22 3/4 of an inch, and then make my second cut. Again, keep in mind this is from tip to tip, so you have to take into account for your second cut that you're measuring to the longest point of the angle. And then for our backrest, I'm going to set my miter saw at 22 degrees to the left, make my first cut. Then I'll reset my saw to 17 degrees to the left, measure down 13 7/8, and make my cut. Again, this measurement will be from tip to tip. To make it a little easier to see the orientation of each one of these boards, I'm just going to set one that I've already put together on the table so that you can use it for reference. But our next step is going to be to join these. And since there's going to be a lot of pressure on these, I want to use 2.5-inch screws. As you can see from this layout, I have the tip of this 5-degree angle on the outside edge. Next, I need to get a measurement on the outside edge. So I'm just going to rotate this board over, and then I'm going to measure down 5.5 inches. This will be where my screws will be placed. And then from my 5.5-inch mark, I'm going to measure in 1/2 inch from each side. Each one of those marks will be where I place my screws and end up looking like this. So now with my screw placement marked, I'm going to go ahead and pre-drill and counterbore, that way that the head of the screw actually sits below the surface. And for this, like we've seen in other videos, I'm just going to be using a counterbore bit. And now we have a little minion. Now let's just flip this back to where it was originally. Then I'm going to move my backrest so that it's 5 inches down from the top. I'm going to add some wood glue to this 17-degree angle, then use 2.5-inch screws to connect. And I like to do this from the outside edge of my workbench. Just gives me more room to work. And again, make sure that you're screwing into the 17-degree angle that's on your backrest. Alright, so once you have all 3 of your seat supports or bench supports made up, go ahead and lay these out like this, because this is how our bench is going to be assembled. We're going to have one that's going to go against one planter, one that's going to go against a planter on the side, then the center one would just be supporting the boards. So this next step is only going to be for the 2 outer supports. This one, we can go ahead and get it out of the way. What I want to do is to counterbore a few places into these to attach them to the side of the planter boxes, because the boxes are going to be used for the legs and supporting the weight of the bench. So since my screws will be going in from the inside, I'm just going to lay these 2 boards down just so I don't get confused and put my counterbore on the wrong side. So starting with my right support, I'm going to measure 3/4 inch down from the tip of every end. And then I'll measure 3/4 inch in from each side. This screw placement will allow the support to attach to the inner boards of our planters, essentially using them as legs. And then for just a little added support, I'm going to measure in 8.5 inches from the front of our seat board, and then 3/4 inch from the side. And this screw placement will hit the board that we installed for our planter bottoms. Again, just adding extra strength to this. Now with all of my placements marked, I'm just going to counterbore each one of these. And now your right-sided board will look like this. Let's go ahead and do the left and keep on rolling. And again, for the left-sided board, we're going to be using the exact same measurements as we did for the right. Really, the only difference is that the holes are going to be on the opposite side of the board. Alright, so now that we have all of our bench supports ready, let's go ahead and get these installed into the side of our planters. Okay, so for this, again, we're not going to be needing this center support right now. Just our 2 planters and our right and left supports. You can use a couple of clamps to hold this into place, or you could actually turn the box onto its side, which I think that's what I'm going to do. So with the box on its side with the trim facing up, I'm going to bring the angled edge of the top so that it sits flush against my trim. And then the angled edge of this front, I'll pull it out until it's flush with the inside edge of this front board. So now that we have this into position, let's go ahead and screw it down using 2.5-inch exterior screws. So now that we have our left support attached, We're going to go ahead and do the same thing for the right, and then we'll be ready to assemble this bench. We are almost done. And here's another tip. If you're planning on staining, painting, or putting a urethane on your planter boxes, go ahead and do that before you install these supports. Okay, so now that we have both of these installed, it's time to put some slats on. So to prepare these slats for install, I'm going to go ahead and pre-bore all of my bench slats. For this, I'm going to set the one board that's 45.5 inches aside for now. And I'm just going to measure in 3/4 of an inch from each end of my boards. I'm going to measure down 23 inches to the center and make a mark there. Then I'll just measure up 3/4 of an inch on each one of my marks, making sure that my screw placement is in the center. This is going to keep all of my screws nice and straight and make sure that they fall into the center of my supports. Now, as far as the 45.5 inch board, for the ends, we're going to measure in the exact same. The center is going to be the only difference because of the length, so that placement will be 22 3/4 of an inch. But still, it's in the center of that board. Now with everything counterboard, it's just a matter of slapping these slats into place. Okay, so to install these slats, I just have my two planter boxes spaced out at 46 inches apart. That way, my slats just slide right in. So to lock down this spacing, I'm going to go ahead and install this first slat, which will sit flush with the edge of our support, and then our backrest top slat. And to install these slats, I'll be using an 1 3/4 deck screws. The good thing about these is that you can pretty much get them in about any color that you would like. Whenever I get to the top backrest support, the trim on the planters is going to keep me from going all the way to the top. And that'll be completely fine, because in the end, it's going to match up perfectly with the rest of our spacing. At this point, we have our shorter board set aside to use last. So now that we have our front and back board on, kind of locking down our spacing here, let's go ahead and add this middle support board. We're just going to center this up with both of our holes and make sure that the front side is flush with our slat. Now we just need to put in the rest of our boards. And I'm going to be using 3/4 of an inch spacing in between each one of these boards. So I've cut some 3/4 inch spacer boards out of scrap. Then whenever you get to installing the back, the very bottom board will be installed with the edge sitting against the seat boards. And then just like we did for our seat, we can use our spacers or measure out 3/4 of an inch between each board. Alright, so once you get to this point, we only have two boards left. We have one more 46-inch board and then that mysterious shorter board. This 46-inch board, we're going to install this in the front directly over our 1.5 by 1.5 inch boards, just like that. This is going to give the front a nice finished look. And then for our shorter board, it's actually going to go in between our trim and sit on the tops of each one of these supports. And I'm actually going to pull mine forward just a little bit. That way it kind of blends in with the rest of the boards on this back. But ultimately, it's up to you. So again, another project that shows with just a bit of creativity, you can use just about any type of building material to make something great. So until next time, guys, get up, get out, and make something awesome. We'll see ya. Ever tried to build something only to feel completely lost? Crooked cuts, wobbly joints, tools you don't even know how to use or even if you need to use them. Yep. I've been there too. And that's why I created Woodworking Kickstart. It's the course that I wish that I had whenever I was first getting started, where everything is broken down step by step, so you actually know what you're doing and more importantly, why. No guessing, no wasted material, no frustration. Just a clear structured path to get you building with confidence. You'll get detailed tool guides, never before seen instructional videos, and 6 unique woodworking projects carefully designed to naturally build your skills from the ground up. So you can spend years making mistakes and learning things the hard way like I did, or you can start building with confidence today. So join me in Woodworking Kickstart, and let's get your journey started.